Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest instalment of Remote Agile London. Hope everyone is doing well today. I can't fix the weather, so I apologise for that. But we're all, well, most of us working remote, so we're all stuck inside anyway. So hope everyone's had a nice dry day today. So thank you for joining us tonight. Good to see some of you returning and some new faces. As always, just want to quickly cover some house rules before we kick off. Please, can I just request that you do remain on mute throughout the whole session? Not that I don't like to, or we don't like to hear from any of you. I certainly do, but it just helps with the fluidity of the event and allows our speakers to have a complete uninterrupted talk, and allows everyone else to listen to our great speakers. I encourage and would love to get as many questions in from you guys tonight to our speakers. Please though, if I may request that you put them privately into the chat at the bottom, sent to me, and I will then ask them to the speakers from there. Please also help me out and ensure your question is clearly marked to which speaker you want me to ask it to, and your question is really, really clear and clear enough for someone, a recruiter like me, to understand. So tonight we have Nick Walker, who is Head of Agile Delivery at iTech Media, and we have Dave Snowden, who is the founder at Cognitive Edge. First up, we've got Nick. As I say, he's Head of Agile Delivery at iTech Media. His talk is on alignment and autonomy, a practical approach. In this talk, Nick will talk about autonomy for teams, as it's regularly seen as a real goal. But how do you get there? How does it work when you're part of a big company with lots of teams and existing structure? Nick wants to talk about that this evening. So Nick, I'm going to hand over to you. Do you want to just share your screens or share your screen? I'll confirm if we're all good to go, and then I will pass on to you.
Good.
Okay, it sounds good, and yep, screen's good. So Nick, over to you.
Great, thanks. So hi everyone. As kind of just mentioned, I'm Nick Walker, and I'm here to talk to you about alignment and autonomy. For those of you that haven't seen me speak before, and haven't had the pleasure of speaking at Agile London before, but I like to be really practical, and sometimes I swear, and I hope you kind of all have a glass, because I certainly have one, so cheers. So, as I said, I'm Nick Walker. I'm here because I love to give presentations. You can find me at Nick Walker on Twitter, or you can always stalk me on LinkedIn. More than happy to answer any questions or give feedback or kind of whatever you want. Or if you just want to send me hate mail, that's fine too. I do sometimes chat a bit of shit. So here we go. I want to start talking about autonomy, and it's something, you know, in my career, certainly it's come up quite a lot. And I looked at kind of a bit of a definition of what it is, and I quite like this one. You know, the idea of autonomy is kind of freedom of control from external control or influence. Ultimately, it's about independence. And I think in the context of, you know, why we're all here and as kind of practitioners of Agile, it's all about, you know, our ability to define our own destiny. Think about how we want to work, or, you know, define our own, you know, initiatives or projects and what that means and what that doesn't mean. And I think it's something that, you know, gets held up aloft quite regularly whenever you kind of read anything or look at anything about, you know, what is independence and what is kind of autonomy, because it seems to be that nirvana for teams to have. But I don't think most of us are ready. And kind of in my experience of leading teams and working with teams over quite a few years now, and certainly being one of these people, you know, 6, 7, 8 years ago, not being ready for autonomy. Like if I was kind of given free reins as, you know, a scrum master or delivery lead over a team, I don't think I'd know where to start. Like I think I'd miss things. So what I want to talk about today is a methodology that you might use to help bridge that gap, about some practical steps about how you might build up that, you know, trust and mastery over the time. So look, let's think about how we can make that happen. Think about culture, think about maturity. I want to sort of introduce you to the idea of team charters, and I'm sure that many of you have already done the idea of team charters in the past, but I want to talk about it in a perhaps like a slightly different context. So for those that aren't familiar with Team Charter, or at least I can give my own definition of it, it's a list of things that we need or want to happen. It's a commitment. It's a commitment to ourselves. It's built up by the team, and I'm sure there's a million different workshops, again, that some of you or many of you probably have done in the past. But essentially, a team charter is something that a team at any level can come together and say, look, here's the different things that we want to be able to do. Here's the different things that we think are important to us. Think of it almost like a team level RACI, but without the individual parts of it. And really kind of want to emphasize this, it can be done by any team at any level. So it doesn't have to be like a Scrum team or an Agile development team. It could be a leadership team. It could be any team whatsoever. It could be a HR team. It could be an SEO team. It could be anyone. But it's a list of things that that group of people have acknowledged and defined and said, look, if we do these things, we will be successful. We need to do these things. I think that's the important part. It keeps us honest. You know, having that conversation about what's really important to us. Why do we have it? Why do we need it? It can be broad or specific. You can be, hey, we want to do this very specific thing, or actually, we really care about this value. So that's something that we should kind of keep important to us. Again, it's something that I'm sure you've already done. And but importantly as well, it changes. Things change, context changes, and that's something that should be kept in mind. It's not a finished article. But let's do some examples, and I'll whiz through these quite quickly. Let's imagine we have Team Yellow. They define some responsibilities. They want a clear vision and purpose. They want to have great stakeholder engagement. They want to have the best customer data. And they want to have an established ways of working. Sounds pretty reasonable. Team Blue. Purpose and a goal. They want KPIs and metrics to guide us. They want learning opportunities. And they really want to focus on hiring. Makes sense. Team Red. Focusing on personal growth again. Clear goal and vision. Best sprint demos ever, and better tools and processes. So imagine in your organization or your team or company or kind of whatever it is, you then suddenly have multiple team charters that everyone is doing. And I think already you can see that there's some obvious ones that are starting to line up. Everyone wants a clear vision and goal. Most people want us to focus on hiring. And there's probably a few others in there that I'm purposely ignoring because it's too difficult to talk about in 20 minutes. But those things are suddenly starting to align. As a company, if we were thinking about, you know, our purpose and goal or our hiring strategy, you might want to use OB. Who knows? You want to try and leverage that relationship. And if you do it individually, it's going to be really hard. But if you want to kind of do it as a group, you can kind of have a lot more power and a lot more, less waste, should I say. So look, let's align. You've got those three groups of people now. They come up with their own team charters. They come together. Let's have that conversation. Where should we align? What's the reason? Could it be that you can have better rates with OB for it? Is it because actually you might all want to share the same goal? Or there might be some other reasons to do that. But have that open and honest conversation. And with those team charters, you've got something to go from. Get buy-in from everyone, commit and help each other to meet those needs and goals. If you're going to say, hey, we're going to really focus on hiring and that's something we're going to align on, then align on it. Work together, figure it out, make it happen. And set the example. What does it look like? How do you kind of align on those things together? Talk about what good looks like, keep each other honest, use, you know, metrics or OKRs or something similar to try and find a way of saying, hey, this is what we think that we need to do to be successful. This is part of all of our team charters. What does good look like? You can all align that and all drive each other to make it happen. So we've got some kind of, we can set some alignment expectations then. Because all of a sudden, we're saying, hey, under alignment, we all want to have a vision and goal and objective, so we probably should do that in the same way. If one group uses OKRs and another group uses something else, probably not a great way to work together, especially in most companies where you have dependencies between teams. So let's try and align on that. Use the same language or even have the same goal. You know, as a company, we're all striving to, you know, increase engagement or increase reach or kind of whatever your other goals may be. Hiring. You probably want to align on hiring as well. Makes a lot of sense. Better rates. Might not be a perfect fit for your team, but might be a perfect fit for another team. And you want to have that consistent experience for your, you know, candidates that are coming through and potential new hires. And I've snuck in ways of working there on purpose. I'll talk about that in a bit more in a minute, but it may make sense to kind of align on some of your ways of working. You may again have that conversation around, actually, you know what? We want to have kind of a minimum of what things look like. We want to work agile, cool. We don't know what that necessarily means, but that's one thing we want to work in. But let's kind of continue the story. So right now we've got, 3 team charters. Those folks have had the conversation about what they want to align on. Brilliant. Let's kind of work on those things together, and let's do those things in the same way. We get a lot of benefit out of doing that. But what else? So let's talk about the autonomy part. Let's align on it. I'm fortunate enough that someone's thought about this before, about one of the reasons why this is really important. So for those that don't know, Henrik Knieberg is an ex-Spotify coach. And I know, for those of you that kind of know me, Spotify is a bit of a funny one, because actually the Spotify model is a bit of a challenge for some companies. But actually the kind of ideas that they've come up with and some of the context behind it is really, really powerful. And I love this kind of little image where it talks about the idea of aligned autonomy and why it can be so powerful. Actually setting those expectations, I think, is the key message that I take away from this. We need to cross the river, let's figure out how. So we're aligning on the overall goal, but we're also aligned about what we're autonomous about. You guys need to figure out how. You're better at it than me are, so let's figure it out. So it kind of gives me a bit of an idea. If you remember back to a few slides ago, we talked about those team charters, and you had a few groups of people coming together and figuring out what was on the list, some of which we aligned on, but what happens about the rest? Here's the ones that we aligned on. Here's the ones that we didn't need to. So all of a sudden, you've got this really clear view of what you're aligned to be autonomous about. These are the things that we don't need to align on. Therefore, they're up to your teams, your squads, your chapters, your kind of whatever language that you use to figure out for yourself. How do you want to do your demos of communication? You know best. You know what you're demoing. You know who your stakeholders are. You have better relationships with them. Why would we align on that? You have that context and those specialisms that we don't. Personal growth. Different teams, different areas will have different challenges. They'll have different needs. So why do we want to align on that? Again, being specific and setting these expectations about what we can be autonomous about, really, really powerful, because all of a sudden you've got this great list of things that you're setting expectations on and having those conversations with every team. And last but not least, productivity KPIs. Different people need different things. Some people like cumulative flow. Sometimes, different teams will need like mean time to recovery, depending on the context of kind of what's going on. Again, define it yourselves. You know what's important. Think about it. I expect you to have something in this area because you've agreed that you need it. You've said that you need some sort of KPI, but it's up to you what they are. I should expect you to have them. So let's talk about how we kind of move from one to another. And, I can talk for days about this. It's something that I've been really passionate about for 3 or 4 years now, and I've tried different ways of doing this to quite a lot of success, if I do say so myself, over the years. It takes a lot of time, but certainly something that can be done. And it builds this, pattern of context and change and expectations over time. But it's all about that kind of trust, purpose, and mastery. So, as a reminder, got the alignment, got the autonomy. Let's talk about this one. I purposely dropped it into a few slides ago because I think it's a much better example than some of the others and a bit easier to cover in 10 minutes. But let's talk about alignment of ways of working. If you imagine right at the beginning, certainly, at the early stages of a program of work or a portfolio, ways of working might be something you want to align on. It might be something that you want to push down and say, look, this is how we need to get started. I've heard the phrase used a lot over the past year or so is kind of that minimum viable process or minimum viable agile. I'm not necessarily sure that I agree with the idea in all cases, but I can certainly see the benefit, and getting people started from something to iterate from is a really good way of doing things. So let's imagine as a company, we've got those 3 teams. We're saying, well, look, we're going to align the ways of working. We're all going to start with a very basic Kanban pull system. We're going to, have check-ins every couple of weeks and take the form of some sort of sprint demo, and that's it. Off we go. And I'm sure that, eventually you'll come up with some sort of documentation. You're going to have new people that are going to come on board. And you're going to say, hey, this is how we like to work. We run a Kanban system. We pull those kind of the stories across rather than push them across, because that's best practice. We have work in progress limits because that's really important too. And we do sprint demos and we do this and we do that. Like, it builds up over time, and very naturally you'll start to produce kind of playbooks and documentation that help kind of grow it and establish this as the norm. And I think we should embrace that. Like, it's something that we should embrace and build up as a kind of community or as a team or series of teams, because actually it allows you to kind of move on to that next step. You've got what the norm is. You understand why it works, because actually there was a real need for it in the first place. Then it gives you something to iterate off of. I quite like this image. It's something that I've saved from, I don't know, I've never been able to find it again, so I'm bloody glad that I did about 8 years ago. Kind of the idea of make the rule, follow the rule, and improve the rule. So if we think about that playbook that we've now established, we made it. We make the rule. This is how we like to work. We follow it. We master it. We kind of gain trust that it becomes very much the norm. But then we kind of think about, well, actually, what's next? How do we improve it? In the future, it's going to be different. Our context is going to be different. So let's kind of move it on and see if we can do something with it. And this is where the kind of alignment and autonomy thing comes in. It's a quote that I can't remember where I kind of picked up from, but this idea, and there are some psychology statistics behind this about if I tell you something and I realize that we're doing this right now, it's probably likely you're going to forget. And I'm hoping you're all going to take a picture of the last slide, because that's where the summary is. Show me and I'll remember, but if you include me and I'll understand. And I think when you're kind of developing some of these playbooks and iterating that and improving that, that's where this becomes really, really important, because you've got people that are on the ground working in this context, trying to understand this stuff, that they can figure it out and they can iterate it and make it better. They understand what they need. Let's move it on and improve it. So how do we move things from left to right? So let's take that ways of working. We've defined it. We said we're going to align on this. Great, wonderful. What happens next? We learn it. We figure it out. We teach new people. We document it. We train people, so on. We master it. It becomes the norm. Easy peasy. This is now, everyone knows this. Everyone's kind of standardized on it, aligned on it, etc. But context is changing. Let's improve it. Let's do something different. What I need is actually built on that. Those are the great foundations, but let's kind of improve it. So you end up with this. You've got your alignment, but you've moved the ways of working over here. And I feel, and having experienced this quite a few times now, this applies to anything. Given time, people can master it, they can move it on, and they can improve it. And it becomes autonomous because you've got that foundational layer that you kind of started with in the early days and built on it and built on it and built on it. Same thing works with products as it does with kind of ways of working. You can kind of move it from, you know, original alignment back into autonomy. And to be really clear, because I realize this kind of all sounds like a bit of a nirvana, I've also had things move back the other way in the past, where you kind of give autonomy, you say, yeah, now that's yours, and like, you know, we're ready to kind of give this up, and you have a go at figuring this out. And it went to shit, and we had to move it back in, and we kind of played with this methodology back and forth over kind of many, many months, and different responsibilities, different contexts, different projects, different people. Because it is very much a journey. The first time that I kind of came up with this and ran some teams through it, it took about 6 months to embed and probably about another 6 months to kind of really get going. But what it does do is it kind of really builds your culture, and it really builds your, you know, behaviors that you have. If you want to, you know, bring out the autonomy in people, you need to give them the help along the way. And being clear and setting expectations on both ends really, really helps. But be patient. This isn't something that is going to happen overnight, and it's certainly not something that's going to be quick or easy. It needs to have that flex, and what I'm hoping you're going to take from today is a system and a methodology that might help you figure that out with your teams. So look, as promised, this is the slide that you need to capture. Starting from the top again, define your team charter. Doesn't have to be everything, just get started. I'm sure if you were to have a conversation, and I was tempted to share a list in here of the things that I've done in the past, and I think the responsibility list went up to 70 at one point when I kind of had a really mature team doing this. But you can get started with 3 or 4. What's really important for you, and just put it down, get that alignment, agree with it, and it starts that conversation going. Come together and align. If you have multiple teams doing it, you'll probably see similarities. And, you know, that kind of old phrase of, you know, multiple heads coming together to tackle bigger problems really kind of does work in this sense. But there are other reasons to it. It could be financial, it could be beneficial for all sorts of reasons as to why you might want to do things together or align on things. So rather than doing things in multiple ways, just do it in one. As a company, I think it makes a big difference. We see that a lot anyway. Everything else is up to the team. They've got that list. 2 out of the 4 are going to the autonomy pile. Great. We've kind of moved it on and we've kind of set that standard. We've set those expectations. They have the context to make the right decisions in a lot of cases. We didn't kind of hire people that morning, or maybe we did some cases, but like they know their product, they know their service, they know their team. Give them that opportunity and trust in them to actually do these things. Mastery, I think, is really important. I think this is kind of where the trust comes in for those things that are aligned. We're going to align on something, let's do it well. Let's keep ourselves honest and make it the new norm. Work as a group for those responsibilities. Be honest about what you're achieving through whether it be KPIs or something else. Figure it out, I'm sure it's doable. And then once you've got that, you should then have the trust to be able to move it into the autonomy stage. And there's probably a very good reason to move it into autonomy stage. Your context has changed. Team Blue at the very beginning may want to do a line because it made sense to have their own hiring, to make sense to have a aligned hiring strategy. But then if they've got a specialism and they need to have, you know, a very different group of people, they might need to do something different. But now they've got those foundations, they can build on it and iterate from there. And that's where we kind of start moving from left to right. Obviously, master, build trust, let teams take on those new responsibilities and improve things. And I really want to emphasize here, context is important. What's going on with that team, the people that are in that team, the context of the projects that they're working on, could be all sorts of reasons, but they probably have an understanding that may be harder to see when you're at a kind of a, you know, director level or head of level or whatever. But being clear about your expectations mean that you're in safe hands. An elephant in the room, right? Not everything can be done autonomously. On that kind of big list that I alluded to, you know, one of the things in there is about finances, as a, you know, really obvious example. You can't let teams all the time be autonomous about their finances. It may be a balancing act. Maybe you kind of give them a budget that says, hey, here's your, you know, team social budget, or here's a this, or here's a that. But there's some things that you're never going to be able to be entirely autonomous on. Your team's not going to be able to, you know, pivot into AI unless it really makes sense to, even if they want to. So they might have to have an overarching company strategy. But set the expectation. At least if you give people a playing field of where they're playing and how they're playing and what the rails are, they'll have an easier time to talk about and figure out the best way to do what they can be autonomous about. And they're very, very clear on those expectations. So look, thank you very much. Really appreciate you listening to me prattle on. I hope that made a lot of sense. And I will pass back to the Master-in-Chief.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Excellent talk. Got some great questions coming as well. So I will ask them to you at the end. Okay, so next up, we've got Dave Snowden. Have I got you there, Dave? Dave, have I got you there? I did see you come back on. There we go. Perfect. Fantastic. So just a quick introduction on Dave. And he's founder, or he was the founder at Cognitive Edge. His talk tonight is on rewilding Agile. Dave will be talking about how Agile started off as an inspirational set of statements and values that inspired a generation of software design. But slowly and steadily, that original inspiration has become a set of structured methods, certificates for turning up at a course, and a series of method awards, which have most recently degenerated to court action. So Dave will be elaborating on that. Looking forward to this one. Dave, do you want to just maximize your screen into presentation mode? I think you look like you're ready to go, and I will pass over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to try and keep this to 20 minutes, and I can't actually see a clock, so I may need a warning at some point. And apologies for the fact I can't share a picture of me because for some reason Zoom has disabled the camera on my large screen, and no amount of rebooting makes a difference, so I may need to get a new one. So this is going to be a little bit of theory and a bit of an update on Cynefin. It's going to be different from the last presentation in several ways. Let me start off with a picture. This is a timber wolf. If you look in the wild, there are maybe 3 or 4 variations of canine, all of which are very similar, all of which are actually highly resilient as a species. Yeah, they're generally the apex predators within their environment. Unfortunately, if you domesticate them, within 7 generations, you get this. A whole bunch of highly exotic species, all of which are different, but which are non-resilient, and the species is actually damaged as a result. Now, part of the argument I'm going to make is that that's what's happened to Agile. It went from a few simple principles about how we do things differently into a whole series of highly domesticated, highly structured approaches, largely based on certification. So let me run through what I think are some of the principal issues, and there's kind of like a metaphor continuing here that Agile is a bit of a sheep in wolf's clothing. It sort of claims to be something exotic, but it really hasn't made it yet. So first of all, we got the paradox of structure. Agile was meant to be all about autonomous teams, self-organizing teams. And if you look at a lot of the original XP practice, which was behind Agile, you can see some elements of that there. The trouble is Agile was never going to scale with something like that. When Scrum came along, Agile scaled because Scrum was a structured method. So you've got this paradox between the need for structure for adoption and scale and the original idea of Agile, which was to avoid excessive structure. Yeah. So that's kind of like an issue, and it's not unusual there, it's general. Second, and this is what concerns me, is the major focus on certification. It's actually quite interesting. When we did certification in DSDM days, and for those of you who don't remember, I was one of the 3 guys who founded DSDM, but we did it over a meal in a pub in Cheltenham one night rather than a week in a ski resort, but that's the British for you. When we did it as competitors. So 3 competing companies came together to form a standard because we were stronger that way. Agile hasn't gone down that route. Everybody has set up their own individual practice to grant various forms of certification. And then you've got the ultimate sin in this, in SAFe, in that SAFe to me has always been the antithesis of Agile, in that anything anybody wants, Dean will give you a certificate in, provided you pay him money and do an update every year. And I don't think I'm being cynical on that. I think that's a pretty accurate description when it comes down to it. It is not really professional. I see people in Agile with 18 or 19 sets of initials after their name, all of which have been achieved by going on a couple of courses, filling out a multiple choice questionnaire and an open book exam within the next 8 weeks. And I got 4 sets of initials I could put after my name, but they all came after years of study awarded by university. So that's a big problem. Thirdly, too many recipe book users and not enough chefs. This is part of the problem that comes with structure. You get people who have a formula and they want to follow it. Yeah, you haven't done your retrospective, why not? Yeah, and so on. The reality is recipe book users are extremely effective provided they have all the right ingredients and all the right equipment. But the minute something changes, they're non-adaptive. Whereas a chef can produce a wonderful meal with whatever you happen to have lying around in the kitchen. And the difference is a chef has practical wisdom achieved through an apprentice model, and theoretical wisdom, he or she understands the theory of taste. Yeah? And I'll say here, there's an anti-intellectual tradition in Agile, which is deeply worrying. The focus on empiricism, like whatever worked for me last time will work again, is actually really dangerous. And it's not what empiricism is about anyway, but that's a debate with Ken. Then we get the Spotify problem. Spotify keep telling people that they haven't got a model that people should adopt, because what they did is they lived a journey. And you can't start at the end point of somebody else's journey. You have to create your own journey. You may take some of the principles across, you may take some of the ideas, but something which evolved over the best part of a decade in a Scandinavian culture, which had problems when it tried to transfer to New York, is not something that can be adopted as a scalable, structured framework, even though McKinsey's and other people are trying to do that. Where people do research, we then get what's called the confusion of correlation with causation. And this is an endemic problem in social and management science, in that people will go and study 10 or 15 companies, identify something they did in common, and then from that create a prescriptive model. So the principle is these 10 companies all have a certain type of success. They all do these things. So if you do these things, you too will be successful. Well, two examples to challenge that. And if England or Wales or Scotland want to increase the number of Nobel Prizes they win every year, all we actually have to do is increase dark chocolate consumption. Because the consumption of dark chocolate directly correlates per head of population with Nobel Prizes for over 20 years. And the data sets behind that are much stronger than most management consultants or agile people ever have. Yeah? The fact that 20 successful companies in the States have CEOs who play golf doesn't mean that you substitute golf courses for management training. Although, to be honest, they'll probably be just as useful given the way MBAs go these days. It's why when I started work on this, we took a natural science approach. And we said, what does natural science teach us about systems and people? And then let's create methods and tools appropriate with that. And that, to be honest, comes from my background, which is physics and philosophy as a joint major. I mean, in physics terms, no social scientist ever has enough data to form any valid conclusion. But the basis of physics is you do the theoretical development, then you test in practice. And that's been the approach we've adopted for some years now. It's why this is also known as abductive work rather than inductive. So we're not trying to extrapolate from cases to future. We're starting with some sound natural science. And of course, in the case of SAFE, it was entirely constructed based on Dean's memory of 3 cases which he didn't complete. Which is kind of like even worse. And then there's too many platitudes. Everybody talks about common missions, common alignments, common goals. The reality is that's actually quite dangerous. One of the things we're now talking about, and I haven't got time to go into this in detail, is you can't afford to have a homogeneous approach. You can't afford for everybody to be aligned, for everybody to have the same values, everybody to have the same beliefs, the same approaches. What you need is sufficient diversity in the system, but the ability to assemble. And the way I normally explain this is if you could see the scene behind me, you'd see the odd bits of Welsh Rugby memorial, memorabilia. So I'm a supporter of Cardiff Blues. I've had season tickets for most of my life. The Cardiff Blues are one of the 4 regional teams in Wales. They're highly professional, highly ethical. We're constantly being cheated by referees who don't understand that we've scored tries. And generally we're hard done by, but we hold our moral integrity. Then there's those bastards down the road in Llanelli who constantly cheat, do wicked things in the scrum which wouldn't be allowed in a wrestling ring and should basically be permanently blocked. But when the English arrive, we're all Welsh. And that's called coherent heterogeneity. We're different, but in context, we align in different ways. And I think we need people to stop all this common values, common beliefs, common alignment and start to recognize that sort of difference. And there are methods and tools for doing that. So a couple of brief points on science, and I use these a lot of Agile conference, but they need to be driven home. This is called inattentional blindness. If you give a group of radiologists a set of x-rays and on the final x-ray, you place a picture of a gorilla in plain view, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, and you ask the radiologist to look for anomalies, 83% don't see the gorilla even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who did. This is a universal. It's not something you can train people out of, because in evolutionary terms, it's highly efficient. And just as a sidebar here, by the way, this is from Gary Klein and myself and others, we don't talk about cognitive biases, we talk about cognitive heuristics. So-called cognitive biases have evolved because they reduce the energy cost of making decisions. So they're part of what we are, and you've got to work with them rather than try and overcome them. Now, that one slide completely invalidates any approach to systems analysis. Because if you go and interview people, you'll physically only hear the things that you expect to hear. Things that fall outside that context won't. Which is why in another body of work we just spent 3 years working on, we've been working on mapping unarticulated needs rather than articulated needs, otherwise known as finding the 17%. So I'm trying to throw some harsh reality stuff out here. Secondly, for anybody who's got children, I presume you tell them bedtime stories. And you don't tell them stories about how Janet and John, or Sean or Sean if you're in Wales, stay at home, have a common value statement, complete the family KPIs, and generally do what mummy and daddy say. You tell them stories about how Janet and John went into the woods against mummy's and daddy's advice, met witches, warlocks, other strange beasts, and we have a happy ending because we want them to sleep at night. But basically, human learning comes through stories of failure, not success. If you do narrative work in organizations, you'll find the dominant story form is negative, not positive, because in evolutionary terms, failure repeats, success doesn't. So avoidance of failure is a more successful evolutionary strategy. We build worst practice systems for companies, and we also set goals by defining what we don't want to be rather than what we do want to be. You can get much better alignment by agreeing where you don't want to go than trying to force people into a common goal or a common statement. And again, that links back in with evolutionary history. And then we get into complexity. And the key thing to understand about a complex adaptive system is that it's deeply entangled. Everything is interconnected with everything else, which means there are no linear causal patterns. The same thing will only happen again the same way by accident. And that means a complex adaptive system is dispositional, it's not causal. And again, this completely undermines the case-based approach. The fact that it worked last time doesn't mean it will work next time because the context is shifting. So unless the context is very static, you can't actually rely on past practice to determine what will work in the future. And one of the key things to understand about a complex adaptive system is you don't scale it by aggregation, you scale it by decomposition and recombination. If you think about DNA, from 4 basic chemicals, the entire complexity of organic life form arises. So in a complex system, you decompose and recombine, you don't aggregate and imitate. And that's why very early on, I said that safe and less were wrong in principle, not just wrong in practice. Doesn't mean that good people won't make them work, but that's different. And there are 3 principles for complex system design. First is you need to optimize the granularity of what you're dealing with. So individual user anecdotes are probably better than synthesizing them into stories, because every time you synthesize, you lose key data. Small teams of less than 15, less than 5, the classic Dunbar sequence, all work in different ways. So getting the granularity right is key. Secondly, you need to distribute and diversify cognition. You need to find the 17% who are seeing things differently. So when, for example, we do situational assessment, we'll present it to maybe 500 or 1,000 employees in real time. We'll get them to all to assess without consultation. And then we'll draw what are called fitness landscapes, which look like contour maps, to show dominant views, minority views, and also to very quickly identify people who've seen gorillas, which nobody else has spotted. So diversification of cognition is key. And then finally, you need to disintermediate the decision makers. Sorry. What that means in programming terms is if you're dealing with high ambiguity of requirements, you need programmers and coders to have direct access to raw anecdotal data and not have it interpreted into story points or, God help us, epics. So there's some principles there. This comes back to the question of single approaches. It's a gaping void cartoon I rather like. If you want a carpenter to do his best work, let him use his own tools. We need to shift Agile into a multi-methods approach, not a single framework approach. You need to be able to choose different methods for different spaces. One of the ways we use Cynefin, for example, which I'm going to come on to briefly, in a minute, is to actually identify where you use Scrum and where you don't use Scrum, where you use pre-Scrum techniques, you wouldn't use Scrum, where you use time boxes, where you use waterfall. Different tools and techniques work based on different types of system. There isn't one approach which fits all. And this is kind of like a slide I use a fair amount at the moment. It's a double point. One of the key metaphors to understand complexity is that it's like bramble bushes in a thicket. That's a famous metaphor from Gennaro. Everything is entangled. But in terms of management, it's worth going to the origin of the word manage. This is from an article that Kurtz and I wrote in 2006. The origin is for the Italian, which means to actually handle and train a horse, which implies a co-evolutionary process. The word then gets corrupted by the French. Many things have been corrupted by the French, not as many as have been corrupted by the English, but many, to mean household management, which is how it's generally interpreted, and particularly when Agile people get negative about management. The reality is that we need both. We need magere as well as menage. My Italian is appalling. We need to know when to apply household management with tight control, and when to realize we're actually training and managing a horse, which we can't fully control. And that's a metaphor I've used a lot with senior managers. So then finally, a quick update on Cynefin. I'm assuming most people are aware of it. If not, look at Liz Keogh's videos or somebody else's. We have 4 states of clear, complicated, complex, and chaotic. But the key domain which everybody misses, I've lost count of the number of people who say it's a 2x2 when it isn't. It's got 5 domains. Or the worst one is where people talk about the 5 quadrants of Cynefin, which makes me rather worry about their education. It's rather like when David Cameron said he wanted every school to be above average, which rather proved his wasn't, right? One of the big developments on Cynefin, and this is key to the new EU handbook on complexity and crisis management, which I've just finished writing, which will be published, I think, next week with a bit of luck. I've been saying that for 3 weeks now, is we renamed the disordered domain into 2, aporetic and confused. Now, you don't have to use aporetic if you don't want, but it's a very important word. So just like I introduced exaptive for complex, i.e. radical repurposing of existing capability, sometimes new words get people to think differently. So the definition of aporia is to create a quandary, a paradox, a puzzle which can't be immediately resolved. And one of the key Cynefin techniques is to shift things into the aporectic domain and create various forms of puzzlement so that you don't make the mistake of false allocation. And I thought I'd just run you through to finish one of the key bits here, which is in the forthcoming EU handbook, which identifies in effect 6 separate moves. So in a crisis, you impose some type of constraint to take order. What you're doing there is shifting into the aporetic. You're shifting into a space where you know that you don't know. If you look at it in terms of the COVID, one of the things the New Zealand Prime Minister did was to impose lockdown before she was forced to. And that's a good example of a crisis level decision. It may be wrong, but it's better to do it now and keep your options open. Same applies, by the way, in software architecture and software development. It's just COVID is more immediate. Once you've got it there, there are 4 legitimate moves. First of all, you may well have been ignoring experts. I've seen this in software development as well. People get so obsessed with clearing the backlog, they forget to talk to the systems architects and the end user testers. In COVID, we actually didn't listen to epidemiologists. So where you've actually got expertise, you now allocate resource to deal with it. That's movement 2. Movement 3 is more interesting and more applicable to Agile. It's where you've got conflicting bodies of knowledge and conflicting expertise. So in COVID, we had the debate between behavioral economics and epidemiology. And that's where you need to actually formally stage debates. And we have a whole new methodology around that, which is called a triopticon, which is a variation of a bear pit. Yeah, I use bear pit deliberately because it's antagonistic rather than the fishbowl. It's a staged conflict between experts so that the decision maker can make a call about what happens and see where it moves. If you've got multiple hypotheses about what will work or not work, that's the shift to complex. And I think everybody forgets about complex is that you do parallel experiments, not a single experiment. It's why a sprint is actually, in Cynefin terms, liminal. It's not complex because it's a single line of exploration, not a series of parallel lines. And if anybody wants to ask me the question, I can talk about pre-scrum techniques which fall there. And if you're not certain you've covered off all the hypotheses, so you can't get the right number of experiments, that's where you move into this liminal domain with chaos. And that's the material I talked about earlier, where you literally present the situation to all of your employees, get them to interpret it to what's called high abstraction metadata within an hour, and then you look at the results. Because you're trying to find dominant views and minority views, and you can't handle that with a few experts. And the one thing you never do is apply past practice. The sort of best practice clear domain is not appropriate for a crisis. So, final slide on this to kind of like make the point. I started off with dogs. I want to finish off with cats. Yeah. I live in a household where I am owned by 2 white cats. I get told what to do. And there's the old British saying that, you know, cats have servants, dogs have masters. This is from Kipling's famous Just So stories. If you haven't read them, I strongly recommend it. And this is the cat who walks by himself. And the cat, if you don't know the story, the woman tricks the cow and the horse and the dog into accepting domestication for the sake of the comfort of the cave. The cat tricks the woman into allowing comfort of the cave while he's allowed to walk by himself in the wet wild woods. And the key thing I think for Agile is to be more like the cat and less like the dog. It needs to know when it needs to be domesticated, when it needs to do structured stuff, and it needs to know when it needs to go and into the wild and discover novelty. At the moment, it's just all too tame. So that was a very quick overview of 2 or 3 things I'm currently working on, and a little bit of a diatribe about the state of Agile, which I'm prepared to defend. And with that, I'll finish.
Thank you very much, Dave, if you, as you are just unsharing your screen. Great talk, controversial, I'm sure, and we'll pull some good questions from the audience. I have had some come in. Nick, as Dave has just spoken, I'll come to you first. Nick, what impact do you feel this pandemic will have on Agile ways of working? And that's quite a broad question that was just asked to you both. So, Dave, once Nick has answered for himself, do you want to give your answer on that as well? I'm sure they'd like to hear what you have to say. So, Nick, over to you. What impact do you feel this pandemic will have on Agile ways of working?
Oh, that's a very good question. Probably quite topical. Or obviously topical. I actually think, if anything, it's kind of a bit of a silver lining, because I think it's forced us to change the way that we work. You know, I read a wonderful thing on LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn's become a bit too much like Facebook, but it was talking about how COVID-19 is probably one of the biggest drivers of digital disruption, digital change this year. And I think if you think about the uptake of Zoom stock and how people have embraced some of these cloud solutions, I think that naturally lends itself to some, you know, agile with a little a ways of working. So I actually think that if anything, it will be positive. I think that the very interesting thing is when people start to get back to normal, how things will change. I think it will be really interesting to watch how many companies try to fall back to their old ways of doing things, and how many people will kind of kick back against that, because we've been in it 4 months now. I think many of us are probably working from home, doing things differently, working in different ways. Yeah, I think overall positive. Watch for the change afterwards.
And Dave?
I think we don't know yet. This is probably the biggest, most disruptive change in the last 200 or 300 years. Yeah, so the economic consequences are potentially huge. Also, it looks from, so I'm in a few depressing think tanks, and I consider the optimist, right, in those. This is going to go on for at least another 18 months. We're going to have a series of progressive shutdowns. What's happening in Melbourne will also happen. And to be honest, this is just the first of many. We're going to get worse pandemics. If you look at what's happening in Siberia at the moment, we're going to get Neolithic viruses released fairly certain. So there are worse things than COVID coming. Right? So this is a chance to get it right and work out how to do it. I think we now know enough to know that completely virtual working is highly stressful. We're seeing major issues with mental health, with people being confined to home, with limited access. Your brain gets very confused when it sees people, but it can't smell them. Smell is an important factor in trust, along with other signals. Yeah. So I think we'll end up with a mixed environment. I think the virtual tools are getting more effective. We're all getting very inventive. But I think the biggest impact on Agile is companies will slash the training budgets. Yeah, they're going to have no choice. And Agile has survived because the IT departments have training budgets that other departments would die for. And they use them indiscriminately on certification schemes, training for this, training for that. Those budgets are going to go, guys. And that means all the people in Agile who make their money out of training and certification are suddenly going to be competing with the big 6 consultants who are desperately moving into that market to survive. So I think it's called an apex predator moment. It's time to do something different, yeah, because the old ways of working won't be there.
Thank you. To Nick, what benefits have you seen at iTech with home working, or that come from home working?
I think, like I said in kind of previous answer, I think some of the benefits we've seen is kind of changes in ways of working and kind of that acceleration towards certain things. And I think that, one of those things that it's accelerated towards is how to be more effective and more respectful. Dave was just talking about there about some of the potential downsides of working from home. And I think, I'd be a liar if I said that I personally don't feel some of those, as some of my teams have as well. But actually even being able to then have that conversation about what we do with that and how we make it better. And, we're trialing things like, no meeting days, which maybe isn't as fantastic and as unusual, but actually considering the switch to, being at home, having more meetings, being able to jump on Zooms back to back, and then being able to say, hold on a minute, that's not quite right. What can we do about this? I'm fortunate enough that, the company's invested into, health and well-being for our teams and for our employees. So actually, I think that whilst working from home can be quite stressful, I think it does bring to the front those conversation points about how you can change things and how you can do things for the better. It's also, again, I talk about Zoom, but it's not the only thing that's kind of really been embraced. So things like Miro, Mural, all those other kind of tools that all of a sudden people are starting to use and find that they can collaborate remotely. And that whole thing about, being co-located is really being challenged. So I think those are definitely positives that I've seen from working from home over the past few months.
Thank you. So my next question, I've actually, this is quite a good one, because I think we might all get a slightly different answer on this one. So a question came in to you, Nick, to say, Nick, could you recommend any books or literature and or training courses for someone at the beginning of their Agile journey? Now, and I also had a question come in a little later on with Dave saying, with your views on training courses, as you mentioned earlier in your talk, what advice would you give to somebody at the beginning of their Agile journey? So Nick, why don't you go first on that one, and then Dave, you jump in after.
You see, actually, you might not get so disparate views. I'm quite close to what Dave said. Actually, it has become a bit of an economy in and of itself. I've been to some of the big agile conferences in the US. 3,000 people, like multi-million-dollar industries that are literally there to kind of suck money from people and give you certifications that make very little difference. So I think you should all have very heavy skepticism over what's being offered on the market. It's very different to what it was 10 years ago when I started my career. I think that there are, some, basics that are really, really positive that you should probably pick up. Things like by Jeff Watts, like things like Scrum Mastery are really, really good. The Lean Cycle, the Lean Startup is a really good one as well. Like, I wouldn't advocate for many, but those are probably good books to start with. Radical Focus by Christina Wojcik is probably pretty good as well. But there's a lot out there. So I think to look for those longer term, well-established names that have been around for a long time, and probably from that generation of, doing things honestly and not for money grabbing reasons is probably where I'd come at. In terms of certifications, I think most companies can probably now run it in-house. Actually, I've set up my own Agile Academies. We've got an Agile Academy at iTech, and it's a nice way of actually building your own context and kind of giving that training to people. And it's actually quite a nice segue. If you ever wanted to get certified, you can just do the exam. So I think that for people kind of starting out of a career, there are a million free resources out there. My sister recently finished university and she's asked me what to do. I'm like, here's about 3 weeks worth of videos that you can watch in product management and Scrum Mastery and so on. So I would actually say, use some of those free examples that are out there. There's plenty. You can't go too wrong with some of the big names, to be honest. A couple of books, as I've kind of mentioned, Radical Focus, Scrum Mastery, things by Jeff Watts, Mike Cohn. I would recommend picking those up. They'll probably last you for a lifetime of your career.
Thanks, Nick. That was a great and honest answer there. We had Jeff Watts speak a couple of weeks ago. He was great. And Dave?
I think you've got two things. One is you may have to do some of these things just to get across a job interview. All right. In which case, don't worry too much about the education. Just go for the cheapest way of getting the certificate so you can get a job and forget the rest of the crap, right? After that, I would start to look different. There are two things which are going to be really important in the future, I think, right? One is, and I wrote an ITEL piece for this recently, which was rather unusual for an ITEL book, where I argued that no systems engineer should be allowed out in public without training in ethics. Because the consequences of what we're writing in code at the moment is huge for society. And it's been written, if I'm being really rude about this, part of the problem with AI is that most of the training data sets are developed by misogynist 20-year-old males on the west coast of America who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty, which is kind of like deeply disturbing, right? The reality is we need ethics, yeah? And if you've got ethics or ethics training in your background, that's going to be useful. Basic training in not anthropology per se, yeah, but no anthropology. Anything which teaches you about culture is going to make you look different because culture is key. So something basic in ethnography, even if you read on it and then do something part-time. And the other one is design. The next generation of design thinking is something we've been working on for 3 years now. Because design thinking, the famous double diamond, is just like Agile. It's become a commodity. But generalists are going to be precious. Where you haven't got much money to hire, if you've got somebody who can do several different things and is a bit different, you're going to go for them over a herd. Because for those, you're going to go to the big consultancy firms. I mean, I've said this to several Agile people. The big consultancy firms are dropping their rates. They bought at a really ridiculous PE ratio a few Agile brands, but they're not paying that money anymore. And they're going to actually commodify the market. They're just going to move in with corporate purchasing. So for the space for small companies is getting squeezed. So you need to be at the high value end, at the design end, the creativity end, the culture end. You need to be multi-skilled.
Again, thank you, Dave. Good answer. Nick, can you please speak about accountability in the context of moving to autonomy?
Oh, that is a conversation I'd like to have with whoever asked that question for much longer than probably going to have now. I think accountability and responsibility is another kind of big passion of mine. It's something I've thought about a lot over the past few years, and have looked to find and develop systems and frameworks and tools and methods that help us find that. I think, you know, accountability is a really powerful word. It's really important to remember that accountability should generally be singular. Responsibility can be shared, whereas accountability should generally mean that person has to do something, or is, you know, single wingable neck, I think sometimes gets talked about. In terms of autonomy, though, you can go further down with that list. So something I've kind of developed over the few years, and something that can be done, is when you get into that team charter sort of space, you can evolve it into singular, you know, accountabilities. So, you know, I talked about that list of 70 odd things that were kind of on that. Well, actually, you might want to hold individuals accountable for some of it. So, you know, I gave the example as well about financing. I was the accountable person for the financing of it, and it was up to me to make sure everything was kind of go right. So I think they can live in harmony. I think it's the maturity that you kind of get to, you know, is there a person that can be accountable for it? But I think that, you know, I would say that accountability, autonomy, alignment, responsibility all have to go hand in hand. You know, I think the methodology I'm kind of describing to, and some of the things that Dave talked about, are very similar, in as much as you need to find what works for you and find what works for your group. So using those terms and being able to have the open conversation about how to give them out, and how to, you know, change it for context as well. You know, I wasn't always accountable for financing. I may not be accountable again in the future. You know, having that context change all the time. Yeah, like I said, it's quite a broad topic, so I'm kind of happy to talk more like offline for whoever kind of asked that question. But I think bottom line, and maybe the TLDR here, is they can live in harmony. They should live in harmony. You can use these methodologies that I kind of described to bring that all together. And as you mature, you should look for those accountable people, because there are some things on that list that need to have an accountable person to actually follow through with.
Thank you very much. And that actually brings us to the end of our questions for this week. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Nick and Dave for your great talks tonight. Really insightful. Once again, drew some great questions from our audience. So thank you very much for your talks this evening. And thank you very much to everyone for joining us. I mean, I see names on here that are absolute Agile London regulars. So it's great to know that you continuously enjoy these events, and I will continue to do them. If you do want to get in touch with me, my name's Alex Scriven, easy to find on LinkedIn. This is recorded, this event, so it'll be up on our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And as I said, if you are looking for work, or if you would like to speak, or if you are looking to hire, or you or your company would like to host, do reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you, and I will do my very best to help you as well. So all that leaves me to say once again is a big thanks once again to Nick and Dave. Thank you to everyone for joining, and have a lovely evening.